welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Midnight Shift. The graveyard shift at the old service station had always been a strange experience, but lately, it felt different, unsettling in ways I couldn't describe. I'd been working there for over a year, and I was used to the peculiarities of the job, the long hours, the occasional strange customer. The midnight radio shows filled with stories of ghosts and monsters that echoed through the empty building. But that particular night, something changed. The station was located just outside of town, where the highway stretched for miles in both directions. It was surrounded by woods, the kind that felt like they held secrets, dark, dense, and so quiet you could hear the wind shifting through the branches like whispers. I'd often seen things from the corner of my eye while walking to the back office, a shadow darting behind a tree, something that moved too fast to be a person, or an unsettling silence when the birds and crickets would suddenly stop their songs. It was 1:45 a.m. when I noticed the fog rolling in. Thick and dense, it crept across the highway like a living thing, swallowing up the station and the road until nothing was visible beyond the parking lot. The headlights of the occasional passing car were swallowed up by the mist, and I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I had already dealt with foggy nights before, but this felt different, heavier, like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't quite place. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the task at hand, cleaning the counters, checking the pumps, and making sure the security cameras were working. The station had an old-school charm to it, yellowed flyers tacked up behind the counter, dusty coffee pots in the corner, and a smell of old gasoline and grease that clung to the air like a permanent fixture. I could hear the hum of the fridge, the buzzing of the neon sign, and the occasional rattle of the old cash register. Around 2:30 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a customer. "Evening," I said, barely looking up from the counter. The man who entered was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a long coat despite the warm weather. He didn't seem out of place, though. It wasn't unusual to see drifters or travelers stop for gas at strange hours. But when he walked in, the air seemed to grow heavier. He didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, eyes darting nervously toward the fog outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I need to get some gas. And, maybe a drink. You know, to keep me awake." I glanced up then, my eyes narrowing. He had a strange, unsettling look about him, like he was both too aware and too unaware at the same time. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt, and his hand twitched nervously by his side. "Sure thing," I said, keeping my voice casual. I motioned toward the back cooler. "Help yourself." The man didn't seem to acknowledge my words. Instead, he walked toward the cooler. Slowly, his head slightly tilted, as if listening to something just out of earshot. I returned to my task, wiping down the counter and rearranging some of the snack shelves. That's when I heard it. A sound. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, like the scraping of fingernails against glass. It was coming from the back of the station, near the storage room where we kept the cleaning supplies. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I tried to brush it off as the wind. There were strange sounds in the night, after all, but then I heard it again. This time, louder. It was definitely coming from inside the building. The man at the counter didn't seem to notice. He was standing with his back to me, staring blankly at the shelves in front of him, his hand still twitching by his side. I grabbed the flashlight from behind the counter, my hand shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the fog that had now seeped into the station, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I walked toward the sound. It was coming from the storage room. The closer I got, the louder. The scratching grew, until it was almost a rhythmic tapping, like something was trying to get out. I reached for the door, hesitated for a moment, and then opened it. Inside was nothing. Just shelves stacked with cleaning supplies, empty boxes, and old cans of oil. The scratching had stopped the moment I opened the door, and for a long moment, I stood there, scanning the dark room. But it didn't feel empty. It felt watched. I quickly closed the door and turned back to the counter. The man was gone. The door jingled quietly as it swung shut behind him, but the room felt colder now, emptier. I hadn't heard him leave, and there was no sign of him in the parking lot. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching noise was gone. But it had been replaced with something worse, silence. The kind of silence that feels like a presence, like something is standing just out of view, waiting. Watching. I grabbed my radio and called in to the night supervisor. "Hey, this is Jake. We got anyone scheduled for a late night delivery or something?" "No deliveries, Jake. Just the regular maintenance crew coming in at 5 a.m. You good?" I think I heard something. A noise, I don't know. It was. I don't know. My voice trailed off. I felt ridiculous even saying it. "All right. You sure everything's locked up tight?" "Yeah, everything's fine. It's just, the guy who came in. He was acting weird. I don't know where he went." There was a long pause before my supervisor responded. "Jake, there's nobody else out there. Nobody's come in for the last hour. You sure you're all right?" I didn't want to tell him what I had heard, what I had felt. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I lied. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." I ended the call and tried to shake it off. It wasn't until much later that I realized the fog had started to retreat. But when it lifted, it didn't feel like everything had returned to normal. It felt like something had been left behind, something was still there, lingering in the mist, just out of view. I didn't see the man again that night. In fact, the rest of my shift passed without incident. But that morning, when I was heading to my car, I found something strange in the parking lot. A single footprint, perfectly formed in the wet asphalt. It was big, much too large for any regular person, and it was far too deep to have been made by someone walking. It looked more like something had been dragged through the lot, leaving a deep, strange indentation in the wet ground. I didn't know what it meant, but I wasn't about to stick around to figure it out. The rest of the shift was quiet, but it was a quiet that felt wrong, like the kind of silence that comes before a storm. By the time my shift ended and the sun came up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Watching. Waiting. The next few days blurred together in a haze of unease. I tried to focus on work, but the memory of that night lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. The fog, the strange customer, the sound of scratching, it all felt too vivid to be a mere product of my imagination. But I had a job to do. The following Friday night, I reported for my shift at the same hour. The station felt just as it Always had, quiet, empty, and dark. But tonight, something was different. The air had a weight to it, a tension that I couldn't place. I double-checked the locks on the door, as I always did, and made sure the lights were working properly. A few hours into the shift, a car pulled up. I glanced out the front window. It was a beat-up sedan, old and rusted, with a faint glow from the dashboard lights illuminating the interior. The car's engine stopped, but no one got out. I watched, my curiosity growing. After a few moments of silence, I walked to the door and opened it cautiously. The man from before, the one in the coat, was standing by the door, as if waiting for me to come outside. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The same unsettling look. The same coat, now weathered and worn, hanging off his frame like a shroud. I froze, suddenly unsure whether I was even looking at a person anymore. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was an almost unnatural stillness to his posture. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, and a strange coldness crept down my spine. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice almost too faint to hear. His words were jagged, like he wasn't entirely there. They said you wouldn't be here, but you're still here." "Who?" I managed to croak out, my voice trembling despite myself. "Who's saying that?" The man tilted his head to the side, like a bird examining its prey. He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his boots scraping against the gravel of the parking lot. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get away, but my body was paralyzed. It was as if I was caught in some sort of trance. Suddenly, I heard it again, the sound I had been trying to ignore. That soft, rhythmic, scratching noise, like claws dragging across stone. It wasn't coming from the storage room. This time, it was coming from the woods, from the darkness behind the station. It was louder. This time, more insistent. It sounded like something was moving, something with long, sharp claws, dragging itself through the brush. I turned my head, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing there. Just trees. Thick, dark woods that seemed to stretch on forever, shrouded in fog. The man didn't seem to notice. He continued to stare at me, his face almost expressionless. Then, without warning, his hand shot out and grabbed my arm with a strength that was far too much for someone of his frail appearance. "I know what they want," he said, his voice growing frantic. "They'll come for you next. They'll come for all of you. Let go of me," I yelled, yanking my arm away from him. His grip loosened, but there was a strange satisfaction in his eyes, like he had done exactly what he had intended to do. The scratching sound from the woods grew louder, now mixed with something else, low growls. Like an animal being hunted. I didn't think. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breathing shallow. I quickly locked all the doors and ran to the back office, looking for my phone. It wasn't there. The phone had been taken from its charging station, and the only thing left was the faint hum of the radio, still playing the late-night show. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the room, searching for anything that might give me a clue. But there was nothing. No sign of the man, no phone, no explanation. Then, I saw it. On the back wall, barely visible in the dim light of my flashlight, there was a handprint. It was smeared across the window, but it wasn't a regular handprint, it was too large, too distorted, the fingers elongated and stretched in unnatural ways. It looked like something had pressed its hand against the glass from the outside, but when I looked, there was no one there. The scratching from the woods had stopped. But I could hear the sound now, clearer than ever. It was in the building. It was on the other side of the wall, behind the door. The scratching was joined by a low, guttural growl, like something was waiting to break through. I backed away slowly, my heart thundering in my chest. Panic surged through me, but I tried to stay calm. The building was small. It was isolated. There was no one around for miles. If something was coming for me, I was on my own. I turned to the window. The man was standing out there, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes wide and glowing, filled with madness. He started to speak again, but his voice was barely a whisper, as if he was too far away. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "You shouldn't have stayed. They'll find you, just like they found me." Suddenly, the lights went out. I screamed, scrambling for my flashlight. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I clicked it on, casting its weak beam into the darkness. The walls seemed to close in on me. I heard the growling again, but this time it was closer. The door to the storage room rattled, and I could see the shadows shifting behind it. Something was moving inside. There was a loud bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of nails dragging across metal. The scratching had come back, stronger, angrier. I knew then that whatever it was that had been stalking me wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the station. I ran toward the back door, but it was locked. I fumbled with the keys, panic flooding my system as I tried to get it open. The sound behind me grew louder. The growl turned into a roar. With one final, desperate yank, the door burst open, and I stumbled outside. But what I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. In the distance, standing at the edge of the fog, I could see dozens of them, figures, tall and thin, with long arms and legs. Their eyes gleamed a faint yellow in the darkness, and their mouths were stretched wide in grotesque grins. They moved in perfect synchrony, their footsteps barely making a sound as they glided toward me. The man was among them. I didn't wait to see more. I sprinted for the car, heart hammering in my chest, barely able to see through the fog. My hands were slick with sweat as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to roar to life. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw them following, shadowy figures, all of them. And just before I sped out of sight, the last thing I saw was the man, standing in the fog, staring at me with those wide, empty eyes. Story: The Unseen Watcher. For the better part of the last 3 months, I had been working the graveyard shift as a security guard at a research facility located on the outskirts of town. The facility was a sprawling complex, nestled at the edge of a dense forest that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. It was a quiet place, and the long stretches of stillness often made the hours drag on. The building itself was old, constructed sometime in the late 1960s, and though it had been renovated over the years, there was still something oddly unsettling about it. The research facility was home to a variety of departments, including environmental sciences, psychology, and a handful of others that I wasn't entirely sure about. What I did know, however, was that the entire facility was surrounded by tall chain-link fences, complete with barbed wire and security cameras. The kind of place where, if you didn't belong, you'd immediately feel out of place. I had gotten the job after a string of unsuccessful attempts to find something else, and frankly, it paid well for minimal effort. My task was simple: patrol the premises every hour, check the security feeds, and make sure nothing went wrong during the night. Most nights were uneventful, save for the occasional stray animal wandering too close to the perimeter or the flicker of a faulty light in one of the office wings. But there was something different about this particular night. It was just after midnight when I started my patrol. The air was crisp, and a slight breeze rustled the leaves in the trees surrounding the property. The sky above was cloudless, and the stars were bright, casting an eerie glow on the ground below. I made my way through the long, empty hallways of the facility, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The lights hummed overhead, flickering occasionally as they always did. Nothing out of the ordinary. I checked the first round of security feeds in the monitoring room, and everything seemed normal. No movement, no unusual activity. The cameras were all functioning, and the alarms had not been triggered. I leaned back in my chair for a moment, sipping on the lukewarm coffee I had made earlier, and let my mind wander. The building was dead quiet. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the old structure settling, and the low hum of the ventilation system. As a guard, you get used to the silence. It becomes almost comforting in its predictability. The silence doesn't bother you until it's broken. I took my usual route, walking through the side corridors that connected the various wings of the facility. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting a pale, sterile light over everything. As I passed the research labs, I could see the shadows of equipment and abandoned files piled high on desks. This wing had always had an eerie feeling to it, even though there was nothing overtly strange about it. It was when I reached the eastern wing of the building that something unusual happened. The hallway here was particularly long and narrow, and it had always felt colder than the rest of the facility. I had passed through this wing countless times before, but tonight, something felt off. I had just reached the end of the hall when I saw something, a fleeting shadow at the far end, just beyond the last door. I froze. It wasn't a person, I was certain of that. The shadow moved in a way that was almost fluid, like a dark shape that didn't quite fit the usual pattern of a human figure. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where the shadow had appeared. My heart rate picked up, but I quickly dismissed the thought. It could have been a trick of the light, a distortion caused by the flickering lights overhead. It was probably nothing. But something still gnawed at me. I pulled out my flashlight, hesitated for a second, and then continued forward, cautiously, walking down the hallway toward the door where I had seen the shadow. I opened the door to the storage room, expecting to find nothing, but instead, a cold gust of air hit me in the face. And I stepped back in surprise. The room was empty, just like it always was. But there was something strange about the air. It felt heavy, almost oppressive. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly shut the door, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I continued my patrol, but now I couldn't shake the image of the shadow from my mind. The rest of the building felt strangely still, as if it were holding its breath. I reached the parking lot, thinking that some fresh air might help clear my head. It was well past 1 a.m. now, and the usual quiet of the place had settled in again. I leaned against my car, breathing in the crisp night air, and stared at the stars. It felt good to be outside, away from the sterile atmosphere of the building. But then, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was barely visible in the low light, but I could make out the silhouette of a person, or at least I thought it was a person, standing just inside the tree line. The figure was still unmoving. At first, I thought it was another night guard, maybe on a break, but then I realized that the figure wasn't wearing the typical uniform. It was dressed in something dark and nondescript, and the way it stood there, unmoving, felt wrong. I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step forward, calling out, "Hey! Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. In fact, it didn't even move. It just stood there, facing me, its back to the forest. I tried to make out any detail, but the darkness obscured everything. I called out again, my voice a little more insistent this time. "Hey! Who's there?" Still nothing. I felt a growing sense of dread. There was no reason for anyone to be out there, especially not in the middle of the night. The building was secure. I had checked the perimeter earlier, and there was no sign of anyone else on the property. My instinct told me to go back inside, to call for backup, but something about the figure kept me rooted to the spot. I slowly started walking toward the figure, but as I moved closer, the figure began to fade into the darkness. It wasn't walking away, it was like it was vanishing. By the time I reached the spot where it had been standing, there was nothing. No trace, no footprints. Nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had to have been seeing things. It was just the stress of the night, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy again, and a strange pressure seemed to settle over the parking lot. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps someone had been walking along the edge of the forest, but I hadn't noticed them until they had stopped moving. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered as I returned to my post inside the building. Every sound in the night seemed amplified. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of the leaves outside, every flicker of the overhead lights made my heart race. But it was only when I checked the security footage later that night that I realized something truly strange had happened. In the footage from the parking lot camera, I could see myself standing there, staring into the darkness. But there was no figure. No one standing at the edge of the forest. Just the empty, still night. The rest of my shift passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept telling myself that it had just been my imagination. But when I returned to the parking lot the next night, I noticed something odd. There, at the edge of the forest, were two sets of footprints, leading into the trees. I never did figure out who, or what, they belonged to. Story: The Midnight Watcher. I worked the midnight shift at a small convenience store located just off a highway outside a sleepy town. The place was a stop for truckers, locals, and sometimes even lost tourists who'd missed the last exit for the main highway. Most of my shifts were quiet. The store was small, with just a few aisles of snacks, drinks, and cleaning supplies, but I loved the solitude. It was peaceful in its own way, and I found comfort in the rhythmic sounds of the freezer doors opening and closing, the hum of the coffee machine, and the occasional jingle of the door when someone walked in. When I first started, I was told by my coworker and friend, Beth, that the store was haunted. I didn't believe her at first. I thought she was just trying to make her late-night shifts more interesting. She had been working here for 3 years and was about as superstitious as they come, but I figured if ghosts were real, they would probably pick a more important place to haunt than a convenience store. But after a few months, I started to wonder. There were things that didn't make sense. It all started on a cold November night, about 4 months after I began working there. I was alone in the store, just like every night, when the first strange incident happened. The clock showed 2:34 a.m. when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the door chimes ringing, signaling that someone had just entered. I looked up from the counter, expecting to see a customer walking in, but the store was empty. I didn't think much of it. Maybe the wind had caught the door or it had malfunctioned. I'd heard the chimes ring when the door was barely nudged. But then, an hour later, it happened again. This time, I was near the back of the store, stocking some cans of soda, when I heard the chimes ring again. I froze, listening carefully. There was no one in the store. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I walked to the front counter, peering through the glass doors, but there was no sign of anyone outside. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just tired. It was after 3 a.m. by now, and I hadn't had a full night's sleep in days. A few days later, I was speaking with Beth when I mentioned the strange occurrences. "Oh, you heard the door chimes too, huh?" she said, her voice low and almost conspiratorial. I nodded. "Yeah, but I just thought I was hearing things." She chuckled, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement, it was more like a laugh that came from someone who knew something you didn't. "It's not just the door. There's a guy here. He's been dead for years now, but people still say they see him." I raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Beth leaned in closer. "Frank. He worked here before me. He used to be the night guy." "No one knows exactly how he died, but people say he had a heart attack. His ghost is supposed to roam the store, especially late at night. He's harmless, though." I laughed nervously. "That's just creepy. Why would he hang around a gas station of all places?" Beth shrugged, her expression darkening slightly. "I don't know. People say he likes to watch over the place. Make sure no one steals anything." I felt my skin prickling. Was I really going to work here alone all night, knowing that a ghost might be watching me? But I pushed it aside. Ghosts weren't real, right? The strange incidents continued, though. Sometimes, I'd hear footsteps behind me when no one was there. Or I'd find things moved around, an empty candy bar wrapper on the counter, when no customer had been in. One night, a bag of chips inexplicably fell off a shelf with a loud crash, even though I was certain no one had been near it. And then, one night, it happened again. I had just finished mopping the floor near the back of the store when I heard a rustling sound from the far aisle. It was quiet, barely audible, but there it was, something moving. I froze in place, listening. At first, I thought it might have been a rat or a raccoon, but the noise was too soft, too careful. I grabbed the flashlight I kept behind the counter and walked toward the sound, my heart racing. I wasn't sure why I was so scared, but the idea of something, or someone, lurking in the store felt like a threat. I peered around the corner, expecting to see a stray animal, but to my surprise, there was nothing. Except, of course, the door chimes. They rang again. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the front of the store. Nothing. No customer. No one there. By now, I was getting paranoid. Was it Frank? The ghost? Or was there something else going on? I spent the rest of the shift on high alert, watching the door, listening for the slightest sound. It wasn't until my shift ended and I was heading out the door that I noticed something odd, a shadow. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakable. A tall figure stood near the back of the store, just out of the corner of my eye. I jerked my head around, but the figure was gone. The next night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was almost like an oppressive weight in the air, pressing down on me. My hands shook as I rang up the few customers that came in, and I kept expecting to hear the chimes ring again. That night, I stayed late. I had a feeling that I would finally get to the bottom of whatever was happening. I set my phone up to record, pointed it at the front door to catch any strange noises, and waited. About 30 minutes later, as I sat in the back room, I heard the chimes ring again. This time, I was ready. I jumped up from my chair and grabbed the flashlight. As I approached the door, my phone suddenly vibrated. I looked at the screen, thinking it might be a notification, but there was nothing. The flashlight flickered, and then I saw it. The figure. It was standing just outside the door, staring at me. I could see its outline through the glass, a man, wearing a jacket, just like Beth had described. His face was obscured in shadow, but I could feel his gaze. I almost screamed but forced myself to take a deep breath. I grabbed the phone, turned it on, and recorded the figure standing there. As soon as the camera clicked on, the figure disappeared. No sound. Nothing. Just gone. I immediately ran to the front door and opened it, but no one was there. The air outside was still and cold, and I could see nothing but the faint outline of trees in the distance. I stood there for a few moments, my breath coming in quick gasps. What had I seen? Was it Frank? Or had I just imagined it? My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out along my back. The next morning, I was still shaken. As I was closing up the store, I decided to call Beth. I needed to know more about this so-called ghost. "Hey, I think I saw Frank last night," I said, my voice low. "I don't know if it was him, but I swear, there was something by the door." Beth was silent for a moment, and I could almost hear her smiling through the phone. "Did you get any proof?" "I recorded him," I said, still unsure of what I had seen. "But he disappeared before I could get a good look at him." She chuckled softly. "Well, I hope you didn't try to talk to him. Frank's not much of a conversationalist." I frowned. "You really believe in him, huh?" Beth paused before answering, her voice serious now. "I've seen him too, more than once. He's harmless, just a reminder of how people stick around even after they're gone." After that conversation, I started to feel a little better. Maybe it wasn't a ghost. Maybe it was just my imagination, spurred on by the creepy, empty store and the isolation of working the graveyard shift. But then, on my last night working the shift before my days off, it happened again. The chimes rang, and this time, I didn't even have to look. I knew. It was Frank. He was here again. And maybe he wasn't so harmless after all. The chimes rang again. This time, I didn't have to look to know what was happening. The figure was there again. Frank. I could feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the door. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to acknowledge what was standing there, just outside the glass. But something deep inside me knew, this wasn't just another figment of my imagination. This was real. I slowly turned my head, just enough to peer through the small window beside the door. The night outside was shrouded in a heavy fog, the kind that made everything look blurry and distorted. And there, standing just beyond the glass, was the silhouette of a man, tall, slightly hunched, and wearing a weathered jacket, just like the one Beth had described. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his gaze piercing through the glass, as though he could see me just as clearly as I could see him. I felt a chill run through me. The temperature in the store seemed to drop suddenly, the warm hum of the freezer and the distant sound of the cash register now muted under the weight of the silence. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick. As I stared at the figure, I didn't know what to do. I should have called someone, Beth, the manager, the police, but I was paralyzed. All I could do was stare, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure standing just outside the door. And then, in the blink of an eye, he moved. It wasn't a fast movement. It wasn't dramatic. He simply stepped to the side, out of view, as though he knew I was watching him. But I hadn't moved. My legs were rooted to the floor. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by something far more than a mere ghost. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and tried to record. I figured if I could get proof, something concrete to show anyone who doubted what I was experiencing, it might help. But the screen on my phone remained black. The camera wouldn't turn on. I fiddled with it for a moment, then tried to force it on. Nothing. The phone was dead. At that point, I knew I wasn't dealing with just some eerie encounter. I wasn't imagining things. I had been in this store dozens of times by myself, and I had never, ever experienced anything like this before. The lights flickered. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. The store had never had an electrical issue before. The lights flickered again, longer this time, before finally shutting off completely. The store was plunged into darkness. Panic surged through me. I reached for the flashlight I kept under the counter, fumbling with the switch in the dark. I could hear my breath, loud in my ears, as I moved through the store. The beam of light cutting through the shadows like a blade. The cold was suffocating now, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. The air itself seemed thick, as if something unseen was pushing down on me. I could hear footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible at first, but they were there. Slow. Methodical. Step by step, they came closer. My pulse quickened. I turned the corner, shining the flashlight down the aisles. But there was nothing. Just empty shelves, cans of soda, chips, and gum. But the footsteps continued. Then, I saw it, movement at the end of the aisle. A figure. Not Frank. This one was taller. Broader. It was moving toward me, its presence undeniable. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I held it out in front of me, my whole body stiff with terror. This wasn't Frank. This was something else. Something worse. The figure stepped forward into the light. Its features were blurred, indistinct, like a shadow. That wasn't quite solid. I could feel its eyes on me, cold, empty, as if it was studying me, measuring my fear. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It tilted its head, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it was going to speak. My mouth went dry. My throat constricted. The lights flickered again. This time, they stayed on. I blinked, and when my eyes refocused, the figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished. As though it had never been there at all. I stood there, in the middle of the aisle, flashlight still clutched in my hand. I could hear my breath, ragged and uneven, filling the silence. It took me a moment to realize that I was no longer shaking. The fear that had gripped me moments ago had somehow faded into numbness. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, and confused. What had just happened? Was I imagining it? Was this another one of Frank's little games? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay here. Not tonight. I grabbed my things, my jacket, my phone, my keys, and ran to the back of the store. I didn't care if I locked up the cash register or cleaned up the mess I'd made. All I cared about was getting out. As I reached the back door, I looked out over the parking lot. It was quiet, empty. But as I stepped outside into the cold night air, I could have sworn I saw something, or someone, moving just outside the shadows of the building. I didn't look long enough to see who or what it was. I was already in my car, engine running, foot on the gas. I drove out of there faster than I had ever driven before, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was far enough away from the store to feel safe. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me. That feeling didn't go away for weeks. A few days later, I came back to work, but I wasn't alone. I brought Beth with me. "Please tell me I'm not crazy," I said, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest since that night. Beth raised an eyebrow, clearly concerned. "What happened?" I told her everything. The footsteps. The figure. The lights. The overwhelming fear that had gripped me. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she took a deep breath. "I told you about Frank," she said softly. "But there's something else. You know about the old manager who used to work here, right?" I nodded. "Yeah, Bob. What about him?" Beth glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "Bob never really left. I didn't want to scare you, but Frank isn't the only one who haunts this place. Bob, he's still here too." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Beth looked at me seriously. "Bob used to work the graveyard shift. He died in the store, just like Frank. And sometimes, he doesn't just watch over the place, he makes sure people leave. If they're not supposed to be here, he makes them feel it. He makes them feel afraid." I felt my hands go clammy. Was that what I had felt that night? The presence that wasn't Frank's? Something darker? Beth shrugged. "I can't explain it. But I know when it's him. When the air gets heavy. When you feel like someone's breathing down your neck. When the lights flicker for no reason." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination. But part of me knew. I had felt it. I had seen it. "I don't think I'm cut out for this shift anymore," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't think I can keep doing this." Beth nodded. "I get it. I've been here long enough. I know what it's like. But, you'll get used to it. Eventually. Or, maybe, you won't." I didn't go back that night. And I don't know if I ever will. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too. so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.